Back to another episode of Harmonizing Sun and Moon, which is our theme for the upcoming retreat that we're doing. And in this episode, we have Morley Robbins, and Morley is the author of this phenomenal book, which I have read twice now, Cure Your Fatigue, How Three Minerals and One Protein Are the Solution You're Looking For. So we're going to be talking about that. He's also the creator of the Root Cause Protocol, which is a phenomenal online program that both practitioners and lay folks can learn about to improve their mineral balance. Very, very good material. And also the creator of the Magnesium Advocacy Group. Morley, I know you're a busy person, so thanks for taking your time to talk to us.
Jonathan, delighted to be here and look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. Well, I think a good place to start is, and firstly, I'll just tell all the listeners that you have many, many videos, hundreds, maybe even 1,000 or so.
No, 200. About 200.
Okay, yeah. There we go. So 200 that are on YouTube, plus interviews, and all of that stuff is publicly available, including his personal journey and how he got here. And so I'm going to leave that over for all those other interviews that you did, because I want to jump into the meat and potatoes of this issue and start with a primer for people on these three minerals and this one protein. If you can give us a 30,000 foot view of this.
What time do we have? Absolutely. So a lot of people might know that I started my journey by focusing on magnesium and magnesium deficiency. And I really specialized in stress. And then I coined the phrase magnesium burn rate ties to stress. And over a period of about 5 years, it morphed into focusing on magnesium to, well, why is magnesium leaving the body? It's a constant process. Oh, there's something called oxidative stress. And we live on a planet with oxygen, right? And we've assumed that it's a good guy. It's not. It's actually a poison. And I read an article from an Italian researcher, and he said one of the greatest stresses on planet Earth is oxidative stress. And I went, oh my gosh. And then he made a reference to iron. And it was like this ton of bricks, just like, oh my gosh, that's why the magnesium keeps getting kicked out of the cell, because of oxidative stress. And then that led me to, well, how do we regulate iron? Oh, we regulate it with copper. Apparently that's not taught anywhere on the planet. It's in the literature. It's deep, deep, deep in the literature, but it's not taught anywhere. And so you have this interplay between copper and iron and oxygen. And if that doesn't go well, magnesium is going to get the boot. And so people see this diagram behind me. Well, I call it the pecking order of the minerals. It's actually a diagram from Egyptian healing. It's a beautiful print, but at the very top of it is copper. And if copper is off, everything's going to be off. And copper has a unique property in that it's the only element on the planet that can regulate both iron and oxygen at the same time. And so that puts it in a unique and vaulted status. And the reason for the title of the book, Cure Your Fatigue, it's a play on two things. One is Douglas Wallace, who's a famous geneticist at UPenn in Philadelphia. He wrote a very important article in 2005 where he talked about the glaring defect of conventional medicine is not understanding energy deficiency. And that is where 100% of the conditions that are outlined in the Merck manual start with loss of energy. And why is the energy going down? Well, it's usually because there's not enough copper or there's too much iron. And what I've learned over the years is that you have two forms of stress. You have acute stress. You were in a car accident, you ate a lousy meal, you had a fight with your spouse, whatever. And that causes immediate loss of magnesium. But then you can have what's called chronic stress, like what we all experienced the last 3 years, where we're looking over our shoulder, wondering what's next. We know there's another shoe that's going to drop. And when we're in a state of chronic stress, that triggers an increased production of cortisol and adrenaline. Everybody knows that, right? Well, all of these steroid hormones are responding to the state of oxygen in the body. And what a lot of people might not know is that when you start pumping cortisol, you're increasing the production of metallothionein, which is a very powerful metal binding protein in the cell that has an acute affinity for copper. And in fact, it binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. So we have to stop and say, wait a minute. I know people that are twice as strong as I am. I know a couple of people who are 3 times as strong as I am. We can't relate to 1,000 times stronger. It's so far beyond our consciousness. But there's a reason why metallothionein binds up copper, is because it doesn't want to have any problems in the cell with unbound copper. And there really is no unbound copper. That's the twisted thinking of Carl Pfeiffer from the 1960s. And there's proof that there is no unbound copper. We can talk about that maybe later, but the point is, the meme that runs the planet, that runs the healing circles of the planet, is you're anemic and you're copper toxic. And that is a bold-faced lie. And in fact, it's just the opposite. We have a tremendous lack of copper in our environment now. And the 3 principal agents that are chelating it are glyphosate out of the soil, high fructose corn syrup. It has a dual action. It blocks copper uptake in the cells, but it also, once fructose becomes sorbitol, which it does, and sorbitol binds up 98% of copper inside the body. That's a problem. And then we have a third chemical called antibiotics. All of the 4th generation antibiotics, like Cipro, are copper chelators. Oh, we're just trying to keep the copper away from the bacteria. What people need to understand is that this big blurb on the book, that's the mitochondria, right? Well, its nickname is the purple bacteria. And so people need to understand that these chemicals that they've been exposed to don't just stop at the pathogens. They go right into our cell, right into our energy producing mitochondria. So you can do a lot with understanding just those 3 minerals: copper and iron and magnesium. And the protein that I refer to is called ceruloplasmin. Cerulo, blue, sky blue, plasmin in the blood. And it's a really important protein. Everyone knows about melatonin. Oh, it's that sleep aid. No, it's the master antioxidant inside the mitochondria. Everybody knows about glutathione. Oh, what's the master antioxidant? Yeah, inside the cell. And ceruloplasmin is the master antioxidant inside the body. And what makes it unique is it has 20 copper binding sites in its exon. That's a really big deal. And what that implies is that it has multifunctionality. And that means that it has many enzyme functions, not just the ferroxidase enzyme that they want us to think is the sole purpose of that protein. And it's an important enzyme, don't get me wrong. But the Swedish physiologists, Holmberg and Laurel, who first wrote about it in the late 40s, they were reverential about what ceruloplasmin did. And in the early research in the 50s, they were reverential. And then in the 60s, it became an object of scorn and dismay by Big Pharma. And so most people have never heard of it. Most practitioners have never heard of it. If they have, it might have been on an examination around Wilson's disease, and they summarily forgot it and moved on. And so we live in the phrase I use, Jonathan, is we live in a Kupro, ignorant, Pharaoh, arrogant world where iron dominates the thinking and copper is MIA. People don't know about it. A lot of people know about magnesium deficiency, and so they'll focus on supplementing with magnesium, which is good, but you could drink a bucket of magnesium and not correct the copper iron dysregulation that's causing the unchecked magnesium burn rate. So that gives people some additional aspects to think about, and hopefully that answers the question that you posed a minute ago.
Yeah, and because we went like kind of straight down to the matter, I want to just impress upon people the gravity of the oxidative damage that iron and oxygen can do. I mean, this is essentially our current best underlying theory of aging, and so like let that land. And that's why we're talking about iron and iron regulation and the copper interactions with iron and oxygen. And so, I'd like to share just a smidge personally about how I got to your work, because it's going to relate to our second section of this talk around sex hormones. And that is, so I ran a panel and found good total testosterone levels, sort of moderate free testosterone levels, and good estradiol levels, and very high sex hormone binding globulin levels. Okay, so without going into details about how all of those factors work and interact, I eventually found information about iron overload causing this increase in sex hormone binding globulin, and which then subsequently lowers free floating testosterone, which is the functional kind. And I found your work as a result of that. And so this paradigm that's inverted you were talking about, where people are iron arrogant and Kupro ignorant, is really kind of at the crux of that whole thing. Now, there's many other ways in which it affects systems in the body, but if we can maybe go to the sort of iron panel information, where I was seeing things like, and by the way, for these in LabCorp anyway, and probably also in Quest, these normal ranges are so vague and vast that you get no information out of it, really. I mean, you really have to know, you have to be educated at the level you're educated at to actually make it actionable. So finding essentially iron overload through iron saturation and transferrin saturation and elevated, so like high, but within normal range, ferritin and sort of all these things. And that the best way to, immediate best way is to start getting blood out. And so if you can talk about why that works, why is it effective to donate blood or do therapeutic phlebotomy?
Right. So what's important for people to understand is that iron is the number one element on the planet. It's 36% of the Earth's composition. It's a really big deal. So you got, and iron is the master pro-oxidant. That's how the iron biologists refer to it. Master pro-oxidant. What does that mean? It means it loves to create rust in the presence of oxygen and water. Well, that's our body, folks. And so, and then it's important to know that there's a pecking order of reactive elements on the planet. Here are the top three. Number one, fluorine gas. Would beg an obvious question about, well, why are they adding it to our water? We can have that debate somewhere else. Second is oxygen. Third most reactive element on the planet is called ozone. It's very popular. It's very vogue. I wouldn't put that inside a copper deficient body. The rationale for doing so is, I think, misguided and flawed. And I know I sound like a heretic when I say that, but I'm very focused on making sure that the copper is bioavailable. And what do I mean by that? It means that the copper needs to be complexed in its proteins and enzymes. Copper works through its enzymes. That's how it gets the work done. That's how it's so influential. Well, as it relates to iron, it's important for people to realize that in a typical adult body, we have 100 milligrams of copper and 5,000 milligrams of iron. Now, let's put that into a context so people can understand it. So a nutrient capsule holds about 1,000 milligrams. So 1/10 of that, very small amount, is the amount of copper we need to run our body. And the human is designed for 5 capsules of iron. And here's the catch. One of the things that the iron biologists, people like Robert Crichton and Gutteridge and Hallowell, Jamie Collins, these luminaries who've been studying iron their whole professional career, Douglas Kell, what they agree on is that we accumulate 1 milligram of iron every day we're on the planet. So I'm 70 times 365, and it's a big number. It's a scary big number. It's like 24,000 milligrams of iron. So you can do the math for yourself. Listeners can do the math for themselves. And this is not Morley math. This is not me making this stuff up. This is what the iron biologists, in fact, when I approached Robert Crichton on my 65th birthday, 5 years ago, I just called him up out of the blue. And I asked him if he would send me a signed copy of his latest textbook for my birthday. And he said, I would be delighted. And he got my address. I mean, the guy was just charming as all get out. He's over in the Netherlands. And as he was taking down my address, he said, now, Morley, I want to make sure you understand something. I said, what's that? He says, you understand we accumulate 1 milligram of iron every day we're on the planet. I said, yes, sir. I'm very familiar with your research. And he chuckled about that. It's a big deal, folks. 1 milligram a day. And that's being conservative.
I would imagine that number probably considers a scenario something like Paleolithic human, and not necessarily modern human that is getting iron fortified things and high fructose corn syrup and all these other elements that you were talking about that interact with it.
Absolutely. And I was just going to share with the listeners, I grew up in the 50s. So, they thought nothing of having my Cheerios and Frosted Flakes and my, glazed donuts and, on and on and on. And so we know that we've been exposed to a lot of iron, to your point. So people just need to understand that the iron does build inside our body. And we can look at pictures of our ancestors, pictures, great-grandparents, maybe if you're lucky, you might have someone, great-great-grandparent. We look the same on the outside. I would contend that we look very different on the inside because you and I, and the people who are listening to this are carrying way more iron. And you made reference to iron being a cause of aging. Well, there are actually 3 causes. There are 3 hotly debated causes of aging: iron accumulation, oxidative stress that was first coined by Denham Harmon back in 1956. And the third is glycation. Well, iron is instrumental in causing oxidative stress and glycation. So I think iron, when push comes to shove, iron is at the center of the problem. And so the way I characterize it is iron causes aging and copper causes longevity. So let's come back to the copper-iron dynamic. In the world of traditional Chinese medicine, and what do they know? They've only been doing this for 5,000 years. But they call copper the general, and they call iron the foot soldier. Well, you don't have to be in the military to know that there are fewer generals than there are foot soldiers. Generals have what? They've got more brass, right? And what's brass made out of? Copper, ding, ding, ding. And so it's hard to imagine that 100 milligrams of one substance can regulate thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of another element, but that's the way our body is set up. And there are two reasons why women outlive men. Do you know what they are, Jonathan?
Well, I would imagine it's iron loss through menstruation.
Right. And the other is women are smarter. They have more electromagnetic energy in their brain, and that allows them to think better than you and I do. It's just, but the iron loss, the blood loss is very, very important. And it was Jerry Sullivan, who was an MD, PhD in Florida, who in the early 80s coined the concept of the iron heart hypothesis. That he was trying to understand as a pathologist, why do women not die in their 30s and 40s, but then they start to die in their 50s and 60s from heart disease? And he pieced it together. And it was very disruptive to conventional cardiology, as you can imagine. But it's important for people to realize is that iron accumulates first and foremost in our liver, right? This big giant battery under our right rib cage. And when did they first know this was important? It was in 1928. Two different research teams, one headed up by Dr. Hart at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in March of 1928, and a second group in University of Kentucky headed up by Dr. McHarg in May of 1928, and they did similar experiments. They withheld copper in the diet of rodents and just stood back to see what happens. And what they were documenting and what they recorded was that there was a massive accumulation of iron in the liver of these rodents. It took almost 100 years to prove this genetically. And in 2021, Kim and Gonzalez studied 12 different genes to see if any of the genes had an upregulation in the presence of copper deficiency, and only one did. And it's the ferritin light chain, which is it's a storage protein for the liver and the spleen. But ferritin light chain is very different than ferritin heavy chain. And I don't know if we need to get into that right now. But the important thing is ferritin light chain shot up like a rocket in the face of copper deficiency, and they were able to prove genetically that Hart and McHarg were right back in 1928. Like we needed proof of it. But the important thing is iron accumulates in the liver, then in the endocrine glands, then in the heart, pancreas, kidneys, brain, and elsewhere. And there isn't a recognized order, but it seems that liver, endocrine, heart is the sequence that's most recognized. Now, to your question, why should we donate blood? Well, there is no known metabolic, hormonal, enzymatic process to get rid of excess iron. Once it's in the body, it stays in the body, with the one exception of blood loss. And the Red Cross has studied this many times in longitudinal studies. They've studied blood donors, regular blood donors, versus non-donors. And in every study they've ever done, the donors always outlive the non-donors. And it's for obvious reasons. And the value of it is that certainly any man and any postmenopausal woman should be engaging in quarterly blood donations. And it's the most effective tonic to improve your health. It's the simplest thing you can do. Why? Because it lowers your oxidative stress. It lowers the chance for lipid peroxidation, glycation, protein carbonylation. That means that carbon takes on an oxygen and it gets really funky. And so there's all sorts of fancy terms for it, but it's basically rust. The rusting process that we recognize outside of our body, rusty nail, rusty pipe, rusty car. Well, that same rusting process is occurring inside our body. It just has big names for it, but it's the same process. And so the blood loss is very beneficial. But even for women who do have a menstrual cycle, they can probably do it a couple times a year above and beyond their monthly blood loss. There are women in the RCP community who donate quarterly in addition to their monthly blood loss, and they feel vitalized by that. So it's just something that's not widely known. It's certainly not encouraged by the mainstream practitioners because they just weren't taught about it. It's not that they're against it; they just don't know that it's an option. And there's a famous iron biologist at Indiana University. His name was Ed Weinberg, very flamboyant guy. And he, at the first sign of any illness, the first thing he would do would go down to the blood donation and donate a pint of blood. And he said invariably he always felt better because he was allowing the immune system to strengthen its mojo because the iron does not run the immune system, despite what people may think. Again, we're back to that feral arrogance modality. But the important thing is we've not been trained in the simplicity of these metals, especially copper and iron. And they have an amazing relationship, which goes all the way back to the beginning of time. And we can talk about that if you want. But the point is, the whole basis of the root cause protocol, the whole purpose behind the book, was to help people understand the importance of bioavailable copper that has its natural innate ability to exercise its strengths and to keep iron in check. And it's a very central part of our physiology. There is a wisdom, there is an innate wisdom. And I believe it got violated, if you will, back in 1941 when they started adding iron filings to the wheat flour here in the US, UK, and Canada. And then it got further exacerbated by a 50% increase in 1969. And then it's been aggravated beyond that with the addition of sugars, high fructose corn syrup, the herbicides that we are exposed to now. And actually there's 9 different forms of iron that are added to the US food system. Now, Jonathan, do you know how many of them cause cancer?
I do not.
All 9. So it makes perfect sense that we would add iron to our food system. And so that's what we're up against, is this mind-numbing reality that they're adding the master pro-oxidant element to our food under the guise of, well, we don't want you to become anemic. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors around what anemia is. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. But the thing is, what's important for the listener to understand is there's an enormous difference between iron that shows up in a blood test and iron that is stuck in the tissues that doesn't get measured in a blood test. And that's a very important concept for people to embrace, because there's a recycling system that our body engages in on a daily basis. So we've now been chatting for 30 minutes. So every second of every day, we need to replace 2.5 million red blood cells. So 30 times 60 times 2.5 million, it's a lot of red blood cells. In the course of 24 hours, it's 2 trillion red blood cells. Now, what will surprise you and the listeners is to find out that it only takes 25 milligrams. Again, go back to the capsule. 25 milligrams of iron is needed every day to replace 2 trillion red blood cells. But here's what will shock you. When you find out that 24 of the 25 milligrams of iron come from the recycling system, big thing called reticuloendothelial system. It's a recycling system, and it's run by copper. And that apparently is not taught in any doctor school on the planet, because doctors think we need at least 25 to 40 milligrams of iron every day in our diet, and that is not true. It is absolutely patently false, and people need to stop thinking that their body doesn't have this natural innate ability to recycle the iron. And again, we're back to the general running the show, and the macrophages, the Pac-Men of our body that grab the dying red blood cells, they break it down, and then they've got to be able to release that iron out the back door. And it's a doorway called ferroportin, iron doorway. Well, that iron doorway is run by copper dormant. And if ferroxidase enzyme, or found either in ceruloplasmin or hephaestin, those are cousin proteins, if the ferroxidase enzyme is not working, the doorway does not open up, and the iron can't get out, and the iron gets stuck, and then it will show up on a blood test as low when in fact it's stuck. And that's where a lot of confusion is in medical circles, hematology circles. That's where a lot of the rusting that people may be aware of, it's because the macrophage can't release it. And it's really the principal cause of obesity. And that's the work of Dr. Hubler at Vanderbilt University. It's amazing how she figured it out. And so it's just, there's a lot of gaps in our understanding about the importance of recycling iron, releasing iron, restoring the vitality of the iron regulators, which are copper. And that's really the whole basis of the RCP.
So just I've read and heard you say that about 70% of our iron is in the hemoglobin. That's sort of the storage area. That's where it's functionally used in the transport of oxygen to the mitochondria.
Right.
And so for listeners, the process of blood donation or therapeutic phlebotomy, when you essentially release some amount of blood and you have tissue storage that Morley was talking about of iron, well, then that gets pulled out of your tissues and put into new hemoglobin. And that's basically how you start getting this iron out of your body. Is that a good explanation for that process?
Yeah. And what's useful for people to know, 70% is tied up in hemoglobin. Another 10% is going to be tied up in myoglobin in the muscles. Another 10% is going to be in a storage protein called ferritin, but that's supposed to be inside the cells, not in the blood. The blood is outside the cells. It's extracellular. And when ferritin shows up in the blood, it's not what people have been trained to think it is. And so a vast majority of the iron is easily accounted for, and the rest is going to be in proteins found in the cell and mitochondria, particularly in the respiratory complexes. So the iron can be very well accounted for, but people don't realize that natural process of turnover is taking place constantly. I was shocked when I learned it. It actually took me quite a while to really understand what this reticuloendothelium. It's like, could they have called it something more, obstreperous than that? And so once I realized it was recycling, I went, oh my gosh! And then you really get into the weeds of it and find out that copper's running the show. Well, that's where the gap is. And so the misunderstandings around anemia are vast and varied, but they are misunderstandings. I mean, I take a very firm stance that there is no anemia on planet Earth. Because to really believe in anemia, here's two things you have to understand. One, iron's number one element. Humans, most evolved species, I think that's a valid statement. So for anemia to be true, it means that the most evolved species has lost the ability to metabolize the number one element on the planet, especially in an iron fortified society like ours. And those are the macro dots that people aren't connecting to go, wait a minute, maybe I'm not anemic. Maybe there's more to the story. Maybe there's a misunderstanding or a mishandling of the iron. Yes, that's exactly what it is. That's the key.
So from the perspective of anemia, or the sort of mainstream perspective of anemia, it makes sense that if the iron recycling system is not functioning properly due to copper deficiency, then you are not going to be able to make use of that iron. It's sort of inert, or not really inert. It's dysfunctional until it becomes functional.
Right.
In the case of iron overload, is that same process in effect, or is it simply it is working, but a person with iron overload is just taking too much iron in?
We're going to very quickly get into the wacky world of genetics. When you start saying iron overload, people are probably going to think hemochromatosis or beta thalassemia, things like that. And again, we're back, and I appreciate you using the word dysfunction. The mistake is that, or the point of confusion, Jonathan, is that we have been taught to believe in iron deficiency, when in fact the real term is iron dysregulation, iron dysfunction. And it's dysfunctional and it is out of regulation because of lack of bioavailable copper. And so what's really intriguing about this whole discussion is that when I was in college, all the folks that I knew that went on to medical school all got A's in calculus. They're really smart people, and calculus is not easy math, as you probably know, but they've been reduced to grade school teachers with a ruler. Oh, your iron's too high, your iron's too low. It's like, the question that's not being asked is why? Why is it out of regulation? Why is it dysfunctional? And that's where the real excitement is understanding the various proteins involved and understanding the various enzymatic processes. And it's not that complicated, but there are several moving parts. And so we live in this iron fortified society where there's rampant copper deficiency, and people don't know that there isn't iron metabolism. They don't know that there isn't copper metabolism. There's only copper iron metabolism. They are absolutely joined at the hip of ceruloplasmin. And that's what, again, that's the basis of the book, is getting people to realize that it's a frickin' frack relationship, and that you can't do anything without each other. And the other thing that's important for people to realize is that the terminal destination for iron and oxygen, again, iron, master pro-oxidant, oxygen, second most reactive element on the planet, the terminal destination for those two elements is our mitochondria. Wow, that's an intriguing idea. Not my idea. A number of the biochemists and physiologists that studied human physiology know this. And so if the mitochondria, which are run by copper, aren't able to recycle the iron, which they absolutely must do, and if they can't activate the oxygen in the electron transport chain to turn O2 into 2H2O, two molecules of water, to release the energy precursors in complex 4, they go over to complex 5 and then become magnesium ATP. That process is central to life on this planet. And if oxygen is not being handled right, and if iron's not being recycled properly in the mitochondria, that's where the breakdown begins to occur, because the unrecycled iron starts to interact with the oxygen, and iron and oxygen are highly reactive with each other, create what's called oxidative stress, which we've talked about, and it's going to be superoxide, That's oxygen with an extra electron, and it's really pissed off about it. Or H2O2, hydrogen peroxide. That's how biochemists spell inflammation. Inflammation is poor energy production. Instead of making 2H2O, the mitochondria is making H2O2. Why? Because there's not enough copper in the mitochondria to keep the cycles running properly. And then if that hydrogen peroxide interacts with iron, it's going to create what's called the hydroxyl radical in what's called the Fenton reaction. Spell it right, Fe-Nton. And Dr. John Fenton was a famous researcher at Cambridge University. And in 1894, he's the guy who figured out, wow, this iron thing inside a human body can be really reactive. So let's add it to the food system 20 years later. That's what we're up against, is this mind-numbing reality that they knew what they were doing, but they went ahead and did it anyway. And that's hard for some people to believe. It's like, well, they wouldn't do that on purpose, would they? They do it all the time. But that's my opinion. I'll let others come to their own conclusion.
Thank you for that. You touched on zinc and metallothionein, and I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more, because what people have heard ad nauseum for the last few years is you got to supplement zinc. It supports your immune system. I know you feel very differently about that. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. We were all encouraged to take what was called the COVID cocktail. It was originally conceived of, as I understand it, by Dr. Zelenko. Hopefully the listeners know where Dr. Zelenko is now. God rest his soul. So maybe there were some things he didn't know about ascorbic acid and vitamin D and zinc. Those three elements, folks, are a perfect way to destroy the bioavailability of copper. And I figured that out about March of 2020. I knew something was going on. And so zinc is highly promoted as, oh, it's going to stop the viral replication, DNA or RNA replication. Well, yeah, that's true, it does. But copper is the original antimicrobe on this planet. All pathogens cave in the presence of copper. They can't get past it, whether they're bacteria or fungus or virus or parasites. They all cave in the presence of copper. But very few people know that. What I identified in spring of 2020 was 52 articles. I stopped at 52, but 52 articles that proved that bioavailable copper ran the immune system. And I only found 3 articles in that electrified time we were going through that really spoke to that. Everyone else was lost in the COVID cocktail. But to your question about, so what's the other side of zinc? There is no zinc copper ratio. That's the ill-conceived thinking of Carl Pfeiffer. People need to know his background. He was a PhD and then became an MD, became a psychiatrist, became a principal in the MK Ultra program. That should stop people in their tracks and say, uh-oh, I'm not sure I'm going to like but where this is headed. And he's the one that was promoting the copper-zinc ratio. Prior to the 60s, that was in the late 60s when he was beating his chest about that. But prior to that, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, all of the scientists that were studying cellular activity and the energy production, really trying to understand what the mitochondria are all about, were focused on 2 metals, copper and iron. There was no zinc. Zinc wasn't even on the radar screen. But suddenly in the 60s, oh, we know more, and it's really important. Well, here's a part that you might not know about zinc. It's well documented. George Brewer is a famous researcher MD researcher at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, now retired. But he spent 15 years, I think it was from 78 to 1993, studying the ability of zinc to block copper uptake for Wilson's disease. That's a long time to study an element. 15 years. I mean, he's got a lot of articles in that 15-year period. But what's important for the listener to understand is that zinc blocks copper uptake in our intestine. Okay, that's, again, if you think you're copper toxic, you're thinking that's a good thing. When you understand what we're talking about, it's not a good thing. It's a very dangerous line of thinking. Number two, we've talked about the mitochondria, complex 4, needing to activate oxygen, turn it into water. So I think it's probably the most important enzyme function on the planet, because it's what allows energy to be released inside our mitochondria. And just to put it in orders of magnitude, we produce our body weight in ATP every day. That's a lot of ATP. That's a lot of water flipping into the energy being released. And what does zinc do? It stops that process. It stops complex 4 from doing its job. It's like, didn't know that. And then the third assault is, we've talked about the iron regulatory ability of ceruloplasmin and the enzyme that it functions through, one of the enzymes that it functions through. Think of ceruloplasmin as a transformer. Oh, you want skates? I can do that. You want a skateboard? Oh, you want a tricycle? Oh, no, you want a sports car. Oh, okay. You want a motorboat? Okay, I can do motorboat. Oh, you want a plane? That's the order of magnitude of change of this protein. It's hard to fathom. And one of the critical expressions is ferroxidase to change the oxidation, the valence of iron in a +2 state. It's very reactive, but that's the state it needs to be to carry oxygen in our blood. Basically, iron is a weighter inside our body. 80% of that iron, hemoglobin and myoglobin, it's a weighter carrying oxygen. It's not this really intelligent being. It's basically a waiter. No offense to the waiters who might be listening. But we go to the restaurant for the chef's creation and for their burst of imagination on how to present food. But the thing is, the iron needs to be very carefully regulated, and it needs to be turned into a +3 state. So it goes from being ferrous, dangerous, to being ferric. And then it can be bound to proteins, to either transferrin, where it gets transported back to the bone marrow to be made into new red blood cells, again, 2.5 million a second, or it's going to be put into ferritin. And the difference between ferritin heavy chain and ferritin light chain, remember we were talking about Lee and Gonzalez back in 2021, the ferritin heavy chain relies on the ferroxidase enzyme function of copper. It's a big deal. Where is the ferritin heavy chain found expressed? Well, it can be all over the body, but most importantly, it's in our heart, it's in our kidney, it's in our brain, it's in the nucleus of our cells. The nucleus needs to have ferritin heavy chain to make sure that the iron's being moved in and out cleanly, and it's in our nucleus. It's called mitoferrin. So all of those different forms of ferritin need to be heavy chain. Why is it called heavy? Because copper is considered a heavy metal. And so they're just having fun with us, trying to spook us that, oh, it's heavy, but it means it's really important. And the ferritin needs to be regulated by copper in order to do its job properly. And so the iron needs to be very carefully regulated So it can very easily get out of regulation as we've discussed. But the important thing is that zinc can stop the ferroxidase function. That's not a good thing, folks. So again, it's frustrating to have the command of the literature that for some reason the good Lord wanted me to become this repository of knowledge, and I'm blessed to be able to do it. But most people don't know the literature the way I do. I'm going to be talking to a group of 100 practitioners on Tuesday evening, and I've done this before, and it's hard because they don't have the command. It's just it's challenging, and that's why I appreciate these types of conversations, because the more people hear these terms, the more comfortable they get with another way of thinking about their body, about their physiology, about the process of being out of balance. And what I can say, and building on what Jonathan's already said, is that every symptom you've ever heard of, every symptom that's recorded in the Merck manual, goes back to this primal dysregulation between copper and iron and oxygen, causing oxidative stress. And when you have oxidative stress, you have less oxygen that's available to turn into water to release energy. That's the really important part, to understand this fairly primal seesaw. If the oxygen's not going into water, it's going into oxidative stress, and then we're going to have static in the system. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. I know you're, as part of the root cause protocol and with your consultations, if you still even do them, you are actively doing hair tissue mineral analysis. And I've done a little bit of this in the past for clients, but it's the way that you process that data is very different than how I process that data, which is more standard. It's kind of what the lab gives me and tells me. Right. I bring this up because a large portion of that test is on these toxic metals.
Right.
And I wonder how much weight you put on that, in how some of these toxic metals interact with this iron copper system.
Great question. In the beginning, I was freaked out about it. And Jonathan, as I started to work with it, and it really, I give a lot of credit to my mentor, Rick Malter. He's an absolute genius when it comes to hair tissue mineral analysis. He really stressed two things. He said, Morley, it's important to understand there are really only two questions we can answer with the hair test. Is the client under stress, yes or no? And two, are they able to mobilize energy in the face of that stress? And that's a really powerful understanding that there's a whole bunch of bars on those tests and all sorts of elements and heavy metals and toxic metals and things like that. But there are really only two questions we can answer. And so what Rick did was he developed what's called the Malter mix. It's the ideal reference range for each of the minerals. And once you put the results of the hair test into the Malter mix, you know in a second whether the person's stressed out or not. Because the bars, they're supposed to be a straight line across, and they never are. I've only had one client. I've done like 7,500 consults. I've had one client have a perfect hair test, and she was 95 years old. she was a hoot, and she had a better hair test than her 70-year-old daughter. And so she was the living proof that people can be normal, but she was several generations ago. And so as it relates to the toxic elements, I don't now, 14 years later, I don't worry about them, because what I'm really focused on is it relates to the use of the hair test. Is I know right away when I see this jagged saber-toothed tiger result, putting it into the Malter mix, that they're under stress. And I want to know, when did their stress really begin? Because that's when their metabolism changed. And so the hair test and the blood test that I do, it's called the Full Monty Iron Panel. Those two tests form the basis of the conversation that we have with the client, and to find out what is their story of stress. And it's what happens very often is people are almost immobilized by it. They're like, you really want to know? Absolutely want to know. It may be the first time they've ever been able to share their story with someone that can hear it a different way. And so we really listen to their story. And when you rearrange the letters for listen, it spells the word silent. So we're really quiet to hear what they have to say and learn what were the inflections of stress in their life and when did these symptoms begin to appear. Very, very powerful. And Jonathan, when I started this work, I was totally Newtonian. I was like, your minerals are off. You got to take this. You got these vitamins you got to do. You got to change your diet, things like that. And over the course of 14, 15 years now, I've become much more, I guess I'll call it quantum, if you will. That's certainly subject near and dear to your heart. But it's emotional. So much of the unrest that we carry in our body's physiology started as some emotional affront, some emotional unrest. And when we have emotional issues that we can't or won't release or let go of or resolve, that emotion becomes fear. And fear, I spell it differently. It's Fe-AR. And that allows us to see the word, and it suddenly becomes iron activates rust. And when you're in a state of fear, you become a magnet for iron. And the only, to your question about the toxic elements, the only heavy metal I'm worried about with my clients is iron. And what's going on with copper. And I'm not a Luddite. I know how toxic cadmium can be, and molybdenum and aluminum and things like that. But the liver, a healthy liver that's properly nourished and being properly fed and given the right nutrients, knows exactly what to do with those heavy metals and those toxic elements. And there are elegant pathways to remove them, especially the mercury. It's called MERCAP enzymes. MERCAP enzymes will get rid of mercury. Guess what the battery pack is for a MERCAP enzyme? It's called copper. And so I didn't know that when I started this work. And so the thing is, there's a lot of fear porn in healing arts. And we've got to focus on the particles, and we've got to be afraid of the particles. And I'm a avowed Béchamp, Bernard kind of guy. I'm focusing on the energy field. What's the presence of energy production in this person's body? And again, back to Malter's question, can they mobilize energy in the face of stress? And that's what resilience is all about. And what I think changed a few years ago is a lot of people lost their resilience because there was a lot of minerals lost on this planet during that 2 to 3 year period. And people didn't realize the cost. And so I renamed what COVID stands for. So COV stands for coppers vanished, and ID stands for irons dysregulated. And again, we're back to Hart and McHarg. We're back to Kim and Gonzalez. And when copper's down, iron's high. And all of the symptoms of that condition and the jab that followed are all related to low copper, high iron, and the oxidative stress that creates. So that's just another way for people to be thinking about it. But I don't get concerned about those toxic elements. I'm laser-like focused on what's their story of stress and how has it affected their copper iron dynamic.
Yeah, when I heard you talk about the relationship between fear, cortisol, adrenaline, iron. It really struck me how foundational that was in relating it to terrain. And it seemed like this seemed like a very clear, because that's the thing that I don't hear much when I hear about terrain theory. It's very clear, sort of concrete material evidence for it. It's like, well, that makes it sense. I mean, mineral dysregulation as a result of stress, and stress is not it's not a mental concept; it's an emotional experience, and
Right.
and that there are mineral dysregulations that happen as a result of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is essentially what your terrain of your body is. And correcting the terrain essentially corrects the symptomology.
Yeah. And the person who really cleared it up for me was Jerry Tennant.
Okay. Yeah.
Healing is Voltage, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great book.
Yeah, it's a great book. I took 2 levels of his training. He's a really cool guy. In both sessions, he said, "Morley, I wish I had your understanding of minerals." He's a dyed-in-the-wool MD, so that makes him a mineral denialist. But he's very good-natured about it. But the thing is, he said, picture a bell-shaped curve, and that's pH. So you have 1 and 14, and the peak is pH of 7. Well, that's the pH that's essential to turn oxygen into water. It's a really important concept. And he says, as soon as the pH drops off, either acidic or alkaline, the energy production is down. And that's when the pathogens wake up. It's like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. It's like suddenly it just kind of clicked when he said that. And it's a really powerful way to visualize where, I mean, the pathogens are with us. They're constantly in our body, but they get activated under periods of stress. And that's, I think, important for people to understand.
Right. Yeah. So they are sort of the after effect.
Right.
It's not root cause. You're not down that deep enough yet to get there.
Not at all.
That's really fascinating. So if we can, let's move into talking about how iron dysregulation affects sex hormones for men and women. And you gave me a little bit of insight when we spoke, prior to this call. But what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it is biological. Again, we have to come back to this meme. You're anemic. And so we've been conditioned our whole life to think we need more iron. I grew up, again, born in 52, I grew up with Geritol ads on TV. I remember those ads. You have iron, poor blood. Do you know what happened when those commercials started? Most people don't know what happened. There was a lawsuit challenging the assertion that people had iron, poor blood. It took a decade for that lawsuit to work its way through the courts. And at the end of it, Geritol had to take the ads off the TV because they were misleading and misrepresentative of the truth. Now, what's fascinating about it, you would think, wow, the FDA or NIH or somebody was the one who brought the lawsuit. No, it was the Federal Trade Commission because it was false advertising. I wish it had been the FDA, but again, this mindset that we need more iron. No, we don't. It's when you get into the literature and you find out about iron overload and iron-induced oxidative stress and iron-induced lipid peroxidation. And it was never that cholesterol was the problem. It was the oxidized cholesterol that was the problem. Again, it's never the sugar. It's the fact that glycation takes place in the presence of iron. It's like, oh my gosh, we keep getting, beat in the head with this. And so our bodies accumulate iron. Well, Mother Nature says, well, if you get too much iron, you're not going to be able to procreate. You're not going to be able to have progeny. And it's biological. And it turns out, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm not sure what the physiological significance is, but I'm pretty certain that our heart has more receptors for testosterone than any other part of the body. So testosterone is an important, it isn't just for procreation, it's for optimizing, I would assume, energy production, because the heart needs to make a lot of energy. We expend 1 billion ATP with each heartbeat. Now, what I need to figure out is how much does one ATP weigh? My younger son, who's a biochemist from Stanford, he could tell me in a nanosecond. But the point is 1 billion per heartbeat, and we do that 72 times a minute. It's like, that's a lot of ATP. So the heart needs to be doing a lot to produce energy. But what happens is, as the iron builds, aromatase is being affected, as well as the sex hormone binding globulin. And what eventually is happening is you're turning the testosterone into estrogen. You're losing the ability to take advantage of the testosterone, and it's being turned into estrogen. And then it begs the question, why would the body do that? I mean, it's really kind of fascinating to think about. Well, there's actually a simple explanation for it. Again, we're back to planet with oxygen, a lot of oxidative stress. We're supposed to neutralize that oxidative stress with this master antioxidant called ceruloplasmin, which is copper driven. It's like a tank. It's got 8 little soldiers inside it, copper atoms. And that's what Mother Nature relies on to neutralize the oxidative stress. But Mother Nature always has a backup plan. And what's the backup plan for ceruloplasmin? It's called estrogen. Estrogen is it's an antioxidant. And what's important for people to understand is that each of the steroid hormones all respond to the state of oxygen in our body. Very sensitive. And ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, ACTH does 2 things. It's going to make sure that we're able to make cortisol, but it's also going to make sure we can make the steroid hormones. And that master hormone needs to be activated by a copper enzyme. It's a big deal inside our hypothalamus. So that if the body, the brain of the brain, which is the hypothalamus, if the brain of the brain senses that there's a lot of stress, and it realizes that it doesn't have the level of copper that it needs, it's going to flip to making estrogen. And that's the pathway that it's going to use. Why it uses that pathway, I don't know. But certainly in a man's body, that is the de novo flip or switch that gets flipped, is to turn testosterone into estrogen. And then it has all sorts of secondary and tertiary implications.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in sex hormone binding globulin, as I kept asking that why question to get down to the bottom of it, was I learned that sex hormone binding globulin has the ability to bind iron.
Oh, I don't think I knew that, Jonathan.
So it's a secondary backup system, you know.
Okay.
And the other thing that it's doing is it's as a result of lowering free testosterone. If that free T is too high for the circumstance, it's going to also increase iron through more. It affects all of these red blood cell markers as a result. So for people that get TRT, they are looking at the CBC, and they're looking at red blood cell, hemoglobin, hematocrit. They're looking at these things that are sort of downstream effects of too much testosterone and trying to manage that. And so it's an intelligent design. There's no doubt about it. And I think that's a fundamental principle that a lot of people need to really, really grasp, is that there is an intelligent design here.
Well, I think to your point about that, I think what's important for the listener to understand is the advertising says it's just a number. No, it's not just a number. It's an indication of physiology. And people need to get used to asking, why is my vitamin D low? Why is my testosterone low? Why is my estrogen high? Why is my cortisol dysregulated? Why? There's a reason why. And what it invites is inquiry and dialogue with the practitioner, and to get into the weeds of what you've just shared. And I've had clients who had low T, just a number. They got the pellets, and guess what happened? They got prostate cancer because the pellets are going to raise iron. Well, where would you guess iron accumulates in an aging male's body? It's in the prostate. I don't know why. I mean, there must be a reason why, right? And where do you think it accumulates in a woman? It's going to in the ovaries. And so there must be a reason for that accumulation. Again, I've never read an article that explains it, at least to my satisfaction. But I think it's important for people to realize is that just because something's popular, TRT or HRT or ERT, that doesn't mean it's healthy. It doesn't mean it's natural. It's becoming normal, but that doesn't mean it's natural. And that may not be the best solution to what is the underlying dishomeostasis, dysfunction, dysregulation that needs to be understood. And more often than not, at the very, very root of all of that is going to be copper, iron dysregulation.
Let's talk about the women for a second in estrogen and progesterone. And you mentioned to me that these sort of both of these hormones are they're paired, and that that pairing has to do with the relationship to iron and copper. And most of the time, the dysfunctional pattern that is seen is too much estrogen, too little progesterone, or the dynamic between the two. You can have normal estrogen but very low progesterone, or very high. So that's the dynamic, is just too little progesterone relative to estrogen. And tell the listeners about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's very important. And for folks, I mean, there's a whole Facebook group devoted to estrogen dominance. That's Kitty Martone's group. A lot of good information there, and I've had probably 5 or 6, maybe 7 conversations with Kitty over the years. But the key is we're back to, why is estrogen high? Because ceruloplasmin is low. If there isn't adequate copper in the diet, you can't make ceruloplasmin to run the antioxidant system. And so the backup plan, again, is going to be estrogen. And that's what the body will default to. It will always default to estrogen when ceruloplasmin is low. Well, when ceruloplasmin dominates, it's going to put a damper on progesterone. So when progesterone is on a deficit position, it begs the question, why? And so it takes magnesium and B6 to make progesterone. So it's like, okay, so we know that ceruloplasmin's down, estrogen's up. Why aren't we making progesterone? Well, if stress, but it's oxidative stress. And if magnesium, what happens is under oxidative stress, magnesium gets burned up. The B vitamins get burned up. They're easily burned up in the stress of oxidative stress. And so the key is the progesterone is down because there's too much iron in the system, and the iron is causing magnesium loss, causing B6 to be lost. And what's important for people to appreciate, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, is that when copper is around, regulating iron, keeping it in proper regulation, magnesium can be optimized. It's not going to be lost to stress. And so the other side of it, though, is, why is B6 down? Well, in order to activate B6, pyridine 5-phosphate, right? P5P, that's the active form, right? Well, there's an enzyme to make it active. Pyridine 5-phosphate oxidase. And a good clue for the listeners is that any time you see the word oxidase, copper better be nearby in order to make that enzyme work. It means it's using oxygen, taking the energy of oxygen and introducing it into the enzyme function. And so copper is unique in its ability to work with oxygen cleanly to do just that. And so progesterone is down because estrogen is up. Estrogen is up because ceruloplasmin is down. If ceruloplasmin is down, that means that iron is going to be out of control, and it's going to affect both magnesium and B6, which is going to affect the hormonal production of progesterone. And what I've read, the only article I could find that really got into the weeds of the enzyme activity was an article about mountain goats. Sometimes you just have to stretch a little bit. But with mountain goats, they can't synthesize or secrete progesterone when they're in a copper deficient state. So often, I would encourage the listeners who are curious, when you get into the literature, very often your answers to your questions are going to be found in articles about plants in botany or articles about animals. Don't be afraid to look at what's this function in a pig or a cattle or mountain goat, because very often they know what the answer is and they'll reveal it. I've had handfuls of articles about an animal where 90% of the article is about humans, but the title is about the animal. And so they hide the information. They have to reveal it in a special way. It's there. You just have to be persistent to find it and stay with it.
Wow. So, brings into question xenoestrogens and how this is going to impact the system. And there's a great book called Estrogeneration by Dr. Anthony J., who was a Mayo Clinic biochemist who was essentially measuring the sort of potency and the amount of these different xenoestrogens in the environment.
Right.
And one of the things that was so fascinating for me is if you were to list, say, the top 15 most potent endocrine disrupting chemicals, you would see that 0 of them increase your progesterone, 0
Right.
increase your testosterone, and all of them, almost all of them, increase estrogen, or they combine directly to estrogen receptors in the body. Right. And so how would that interplay with this iron copper dynamic?
Estrogen is very hard on ceruloplasmin.
So it's just going to continue to break it down. It's essentially making you more copper deficient.
Let's be careful. The phrase I use is bioavailable copper. It will make the copper less bioavailable.
Gotcha. Okay.
Soon, picture ceruloplasmin as being a van on a highway, can seat 8 people comfortably, and there are elements in our environment, food substances, ascorbic acid, citric acid, a number of different substances that cause the doors to open and the passengers come out, the copper comes out, and then the van keeps driving, even though there's no one in charge. And so it's a very scary world we live in, and people don't realize how central this protein is, this ceruloplasmin protein, and it's been lost to the ages. It's some of the most important research, Jonathan, was done in the early 60s by preeminent copper scientists at Bell Laboratories in upstate New York. What? AT&T Labs doing human research about ceruloplasmin? Why are we doing that? I can't answer that question. I don't know why. I have some theories, but the point is, the fact that it's not taught in any doctor's school, it's a curiosity. When you begin to understand what it does, let me give you a sense of it. We all have trauma growing up. Well, when I was 6, my dad was dealing with manic depression and schizophrenia. And they were going to do a round of electric shock therapy for the second time. Well, if you've seen Cuckoo's Nest, you know what that's all about. And he said, that's not happening again. And he literally ran away from home, never to come back. So that was in 1958 when that happened. Now imagine my surprise about 5 years ago when I came across some really hoity-toity, sophisticated research at Tulane University, headed up by Dr. Martins and two of his colleagues from Harvard. And they were studying the application of one shot of ceruloplasmin in 34 patients who had schizophrenia. They just wanted to see what's going to happen. How many people do you think were cured of schizophrenia with one shot of ceruloplasmin?
No idea.
30. 30 of 34. So it really begs the question of what is behavioral health issues? What are they? It's oxidative stress, folks. And when someone is in a state of fear, again, iron activates rust. When they're in a state of fear, iron is just coming like a magnet, and they are producing oxidative stress on steroids. That's what schizophrenia is. It's oxidative stress on steroid hormones. And ceruloplasmin stops it like that.
That's really fascinating. I don't want to use I want to know your terminology for describing copper when ceruloplasmin it's not bioavailable. What is it? Because I don't want to say unbound, right? You were saying there is no such thing as unbound copper. So what is the term that you use?
Okay. Copper, ideally, in the 50s and 60s, they were indicating that as much as 98% of copper in the blood, and you have to be really careful, copper in the blood is bound to ceruloplasmin. Various authors in the contemporary era put different numbers. I've seen it as low as 70% now, which is a scary number. And just to orient the listeners, 47% of our copper, again, we're back to the nutrient capsule, 100 milligrams, 47 milligrams is in our bone marrow. Oh, wow. The copper must be really involved in making new blood. Yes, 2.5 million times a second. And so copper is really important in the bone marrow. 27% is in our muscles. Oh, so the muscles that make a lot of energy, they must really rely on copper. Yes, ding, ding, ding. And so then we've got the organs, 25%. Wow. Oh, so 7 milligrams in the liver, 7 milligrams in the brain. I think it's like 5 to 6 in the heart, but kidneys. So it's about 25 milligrams in these major organs. And suddenly we've got 1% left of the copper, and it's found in the blood. And I'll put the number at 95%. 95% of that copper is supposed to be bound to ceruloplasmin. And we know there's agents in our environment, especially ascorbic acid. That's probably the most toxic element, in my opinion, because of its effect on ceruloplasmin. And it was chronicled in the first article about ceruloplasmin in 1948. Would be a good thing to know. But the thing is, when ceruloplasmin gets breached by its environment, by different medications, the copper does come out of its structure, but it is always bound to something else. It gets bound to albumin. It gets bound to transcuprine. People have heard of transferrin. Transferrin is the transport. Well, there's a copper protein as well. It's called transcuprine, or it's bound to histidine. It's a very important amino acid, and the histidine is very often found inside albumin. Is copper as effective when it's in one of those three forms? No, it's not. It doesn't have the potency that it has when it is found inside ceruloplasmin. But is it toxic? No. But here's what happens. This is a really important point, and I appreciate you bringing it up. When copper is not in ceruloplasmin, again, copper and iron metabolism is joined at the hip of fully functioning ceruloplasmin. When copper is not there, iron goes rogue. The ability to regulate iron changes in the face of copper not being in ceruloplasmin. Iron causes oxidative stress. Iron, or dysregulated iron, as you referred to it a while back, causes symptoms. And what has happened in the modern era is to assign all of those symptoms to that pesky, quote unquote, unbound copper, when in fact it's the iron dysregulation causing it. And so some members of the research community bend over backwards trying to prove that, well, that copper is toxic, when in fact, you talk to the copper biologists like Svetlana Lutsenko or Jamie Collins, who've studied it meticulously. There is no unbound copper. It is not found inside the cell. And I just had a client.
So when it's referred to as unbound, it's unbound to ceruloplasmin, but bound to somewhere else that is undefined.
Yes, it's not defined. And in this blood test that this client sent me, she tested the amount of unbound copper. I'd never seen it before, and it was 0. There was no unbound copper in her blood. And I was like, where did you learn to do that test? And she'd heard about it. And so I'm going to.
Was that through LabCorp or was that through?
It was a LabCorp. So I was like, this is fascinating. And the measurements of, quote, unbound copper inside the cell, it ranges from femtomolar to zeptomolar. That's 15 zeros to 21 zeros. Folks, it's a myth. There is no unbound. It is unbound from ceruloplasmin. I appreciate your drawing that distinction. But what we've got to focus on, what we should focus on, what we will benefit by focusing on, is the iron that becomes dysregulated when ceruloplasmin is not functioning properly.
Yeah, wow. So what is your take on, one of the things that I think the first start you have in the RCP is trace minerals to your water that you're sipping throughout the day. What is your take on shilajit and fulvic acid?
I think you have to be careful of your sourcing for shilajit. I think that's the most important thing. There are different sources, some that are more thoughtful than others. You just have to know where you're getting it. And then the fulvic acid it's more of a farming concept than a human concept. And I tend to shy away from things that are designed for soil microbes as opposed to our microbes. Again, there are a lot of people who feel very strongly that it's safe. There's so many alternatives that exist for us that don't imply or have any kind of asterisks or anything. So I tend to shy away from them, but that doesn't mean that they can't be viable. I think that I'd rather take a more conservative route and have a more predictable outcome.
Gotcha. Another sort of like, I have a couple like short questions for you.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the oligoscan as a tool for measuring mineral content? And in your opinion, is this accurate and useful?
I've got a couple of my practitioners who've gone through my training who use it regularly. Again, we're back to a lot of people think that what the Oligo scan or the HTMA scan is going to do is it's going to create a teacup, like we've got tea leaves, and we can forecast and do a horoscope for you about what's really going on in your body. All these scans do is tell you, is the person in stress or not? Gotcha. By the way that the results will present themselves. Again, people, to me, another myth is that what you need in the way of a protocol is different than what I need, is different than someone down the street. And it's very heretical that we have a root cause protocol that works for everybody. Well, you and I look different, right? And we probably have differences on the inside as well. We have different emotions, things like that. But we all respond to iron and oxygen the exact same way. We all have a dependence on bioavailable copper. And so the way I characterize it is that in the world of healing, practitioners are taught that each of their patients is like a mailbox in a post office. Different combination, different key that's required to open them up and fix them. Like someone getting Synthroid. It's a different form of Synthroid for each person. It's not. It's all the exact same. But the thing is, when I was in college, I worked in the mailroom at the college I went to. I was on the other side. I had access to everybody's mailbox. Well, that's copper inside the body. Copper is the great leveler, and it can manage the oxidative stress. And I think that's what people need to understand, is that let's start with the protocol to calm down the oxidative stress and see how does the body reach some level of homeostasis, and where is there still some dysregulation. Then we can begin to address that. But everyone, to a person, can benefit from the nutrients that are outlined in the protocol.
Yeah, I guess my question was not properly formulated. It was more about the data that you get from the oligo scan that you then put into the Malter mix. The raw data essentially is in the same way that you take the raw data from the hair mineral test. Is that equivalent? Have you found that
they're
it is?
comparable? They're
Okay,
comparable.
that's good to know.
Yeah, it's again, in the sense that both tests are valid indications of stress.
Right.
And I think that one of my colleagues in South Carolina, she's done a lot of testing of the oligo scan versus hair test. And across the board, almost without exception, there's great parity between the two. So it's just good to know.
Yeah.
What I like about the oligo scan is you can be face-to-face. What I like about the hair test is you can be anonymous. You can be around the world.
Right.
And so what I really sought to do was to create a solution that didn't require physical proximity.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, this is the only option when you are doing work remotely. So, yeah, I appreciate that. Wonderful. I heard you speak a bit about the effects of iron in the gut and getting stuck in the enterocytes. And one of our interests, and has been for a long time at our retreat centers, because we do a lot of soil work, we do a lot of work with the food and the garden, and is kind of understanding this relationship of how that food affects the gut. And it was really interesting to hear that all kinds of pathologies can occur by iron getting stuck in the enterocytes at different points of the gut tract.
That's right. It's important for people to realize that the absorption of our food, especially of the metals, it's a two-step function. And so the metals get absorbed in the enterocyte, and they're in a it's absolutely fascinating how the body flips them around, but they're in a +3 state with the iron. It needs to be made into a +2 state, so it gets reduced, chemical reduction. Then it can come through the doorway and get into the cell of the enterocyte, enterocyte. Then the cell has to decide, what am I going to do with it? And if it needs to put it into storage, it needs to be put back into a +3 state. We need that ferroxidase thingy because we have to oxidize it. Or is it going to be oxidized so it can get put into transferrin, put onto transferrin, and find its way into the bloodstream? So that's the second stage. First stage is just getting into the cell. Second stage is, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to store it, or are we going to recycle it? And there's a tremendous need to recycle. Again, it's just constant demand for iron. And what people need to appreciate is that something like ascorbic acid has a default mechanism to get the iron into the cell, but then it gets stuck there because there isn't copper to allow the ferroportin doorway of the enterocyte to open up so it can get attached to transferrin. And it's a very nuanced mechanism, but it's vital. And so iron can get stuck in the gut and can't get properly absorbed. Even though it's in the enterocyte, it's not fully absorbed until it gets into the bloodstream. And that requires copper to make sure that mechanism takes place.
This may be a bit abstract because we're talking about this very, very subtle mineral interaction. But can you maybe describe a couple of gut issues that someone may experience as a result of this problem you're describing?
Oh, well, SIBO, colitis, irritable bowel, Crohn's. Anytime there's gut dysbiosis, it's a pretty safe bet that iron is being improperly regulated in the gut tissue. Now let's take Crohn's for just a second, because it's a very significant condition. And what's important for the listeners to understand is that animals get Crohn's too. Did you know that?
No.
They do. They get gut issues as well. But in the animal world, it's called Jonas disease, JOHNSES. And all veterinarians have a very specific solution for Jonas disease, and it's called copper. 100% of animals with Jonas disease are treated with copper, and it clears up. Gastroenterologists wring their hands. We don't know what's going on. We think you're anemic. You need more iron. And they've not been trained that the animal's Jonas is identical to the human Crohn's, and it would be solved the exact same way with the exact same element. And so the iron does get stuck. And the whole, let's use this as an analogy. So these are two enterocytes, and these are the villi, right? And so the iron is coming in, gets into the cell, and it's got to get, the bloodstream is down here. It's got to get out of the cell into the bloodstream. Well, what happens? If iron starts to accumulate in the enterocyte for a variety of reasons, energy production begins to go south. Now, what keeps the enterocytes together? It's called energy. Energy is magnetic, brings the enterocytes together. So there is no gap here when there's good energy being produced by the enterocyte, because there's not an accumulation of iron. Iron accumulation causes energy deficiency, so the tissue stays together. When it starts to pull apart, and then the particles, proteins can come in right into the bloodstream, that's when we have a reaction. That's when we have allergic or sensitivity reactions, right? It's an energetic breakdown of the enterocytes because they're not making enough energy, because iron's building, or they don't have enough copper in their mitochondria to keep the flywheel moving. Very different way of thinking about it. To me, the greatest conundrum of biochemistry is no one knows. I think Arturo does, but no one outside of his circle knows, how does oxygen actually get inside the mitochondria? And a reasoned response would be what diffuses its way in. The second most reactive element on the planet, it's going to be active transport. And nobody knows what the transport is. No one. Wittenberg, 2007 is the closest they've come, but no one understands how oxygen gets from the bloodstream and inside the mitochondria. We're talking about one of the most important transfers of substances in the body. And nobody knows. To me, it's the greatest mystery on planet Earth.
Well, if anyone's going to find out, it'll be you reading the papers. So if they do make that discovery, we'll come to you first for it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Morley, for taking your time. Wow, it was really, really a pleasure to have you on.